is Black History Month, the shortest month of the year. It tells you everything you need to know right there. And I've given this sermon once, and I've already sent it out to about 100 community leaders. So if it's really bad, then a version of this, not what I'm going to say to you, but a large version of what I'm going to say to you. I'd like to welcome Janice Hayes Williams to our congregation. I think I saw you walk in. Can you just stand up for a second, let everybody see you? She's our speaker at 12:30. Bless you. Thank you for being here. And she will let you know if I'm, preachers exaggerate, so she'll let you know if I'm exaggerating later on. You know, when I first moved here to Annapolis, I lived in a gated community. It is called Epping Forest. It is an exclusive, water-privileged community with its own beach and beach house. And I remember when my wife and I were trying to figure out where we could live here in Annapolis, it was actually difficult to find a place to rent that was in our price range at the time, and there just weren't a lot of availabilities. And on one particular occasion, and we have 5 children that we share with our ex-spouses, so it's a lot, we need a lot of space. And on one occasion, we found a location, perfect house. We had a real estate agent, and we went in, and the owner of the home happened to be there. And so, but everything seemed to go well, but later on, we were at the real estate agent's office after she had gotten a call from the woman who owned the home, and she said the lady's not interested in renting to a blended family. And I mean, that was a racist comment. That's what we said. But it was, as I like to say, it was carefully crafted. But after that, I really wondered, like, I just got called to the Annapolis congregation. What kind of town am I actually coming to? I had lived in Prince George's County, so this was quite a shock to me. So this went on for a while, and I got really frustrated, and I said, I'm done looking. I don't know what we're going to do. And Joni, my wife, says, well, I'll keep looking. And she found a listing on Craigslist. Is that a thing, Craigslist? I thought it was only nasty stuff on Craigslist. So she said, it sounds perfect. And I said, it's probably too good to be true, and they probably won't rent to a blended family. And so it was in Epping Forest, and so we decided, okay, let's drive up to Epping Forest. We get there, there's the gate, but the owners had given us a code. And so we drove through the neighborhoods, beautiful community, trees, picturesque. Every house is different from the next. And we pull up at the house, and I'm nervous, let me just tell you. I'm not used to being in these kind of neighborhoods. And there it was, a Prius. A Prius. It was a Prius. I knew they were liberals. And on the back of that Prius, on the bumper, was an Obama sticker. And I said to Joni, I said, they actually may rent to this blended family. We got to the door, the family welcomes us in, and it's all going well. And I am forthright in saying to the owners, I'm a new minister in the town. And she said, yeah, what's the name of your church? I said, the Unitarian Universalist Church of Annapolis. And her eyes widened, and she said, when we do go to church, that's where we go to church. We don't go very often. Wait, oh my God, I just heard you speak a few weeks ago. Oh, we're definitely renting our house to you. And that's how I got to Annapolis. And we lived there until 2016 when we moved to Arnold. That was about 2010. I started here in 2009. So that gives you an idea. I lived in one of the most exclusive and whitest communities I've ever lived in my entire life. And I didn't get popular there until I did their Christmas Eve service. And everybody knew me in the neighborhood. I always held on to that. I've held on to that ever since that because it ended with good fortune, but it left a bittersweet taste. If you know where Epping Forest is, then you also know where Crownsville Road is. And often we went up Crownsville Road to go to the Lures restaurant, which I love. Going there next week with Reverend Fred. In 2 weeks. And if you go to Lures, you'll have to see some old railroad tracks. There was a train that used to drop people off right at that hospital. And you see the sign, Crownsville Hospital. And that caught my attention. I wondered what it was. I thought it would look like some type of old prison or something. It just looked strange. I found out later from talking to people that it closed in 2004 and that it actually was a mental hospital. Unfortunately, that it was a state-owned mental hospital, the Crownsville State Hospital. And its original name was the Crownsville Hospital for the Negro Insane. That's what it was called. See if I got that right. And that immediately took me back to my childhood because I grew up in Washington, D.C. near St. Elizabeth's Hospital. And some of the people I knew were sent to St. Elizabeth's Psychiatric Hospital. That was called the Government Hospital for the Insane. And St. Elizabeth's today is in an all-black neighborhood, has been for so long. The adults in my community, when you would act up, would say to the kids, you know, you better stop acting up or we're going to send you to St. E's. And so growing up, St. E's was the name of the psychiatric hospital in my community. And I drove by it many times with my mom in the car, and it always made me nervous. It looked like a scary and dangerous place. I didn't understand what actually it was. I also remember that when John Hinckley tried to assassinate Ronald Reagan, that's where he was sent. And so I always thought about that every time I saw it. You know, early psychiatry for whites and blacks and other groups in America has a very sordid history. People with mental illness have often been experimented on, chastised, stigmatized. We've called people crazy because we did not understand brain trauma and brain disease very well. We've come a long way. The history of mental health really deserves its own sermon this morning. But today I want to talk specifically about Crownsville Hospital for the Negro Insane. The story of black cruelty, brutality, and trauma. And if you're a part of this county's history, then you know that we have to reconcile this story if we are to become the state, county, and country we say we want to be. Anne Arundel County has a slogan, the best place for all. And until we reconcile this story, we cannot say that. It's more of an asinine motto. I emphasize the word asinine motto. Maybe you know the history, maybe you don't, but I encourage you to pick up this new book, Madness, Race, and Insanity in a Jim Crow Asylum by Antonia Hilton. And you'll get the whole story of the atrocities and abuse wrought on black bodies from the time it opened in 1911 until around 1950s. It was only when, as mentioned in the reading, when black doctors and nurses and staff were hired, eventually the hospital integrated, that these abuses mostly stopped. And you've heard about some of those abuses this morning. To understand this hospital, why it was created, you have to go back to the 1900s, look at where we were in this country, the early 1900s. And then you have to go to the politics in Baltimore. Baltimore was a rising industrial power. And so many powerful people saw these blacks who were perhaps homeless or destitute as a result of slavery saw them as bad for city politics, saw them as unproductive vagrants. And they concluded that freedom from slavery had caused insanity in some blacks, that many had become listless and drunkards, criminals, and needed rehabilitation. And the leading physician in that time around this area called it, he made up a word, he called it drapetomania. And he said this came as a result of their emancipation. His name was Dr. Samuel Cartwright, and he posited that blacks were better off, they were more mentally stable as slaves, and that their freedom caused an illness, drapetomania. And this, of course, is gaslighting in its highest form. To accuse those enslaved for hundreds of years, given nothing afterward, to be the problem. Gaslighting. And more than that, there was no understanding, as I said at the time, of trauma, what it does to the body, mind, spirit. They had no understanding of trauma back then. But now, what do we do with them, they say? Well, we want to move them as far away from Baltimore as possible. And let's go find some rural place with not that many people and put them over there. So the state came up with $100,000, that's $800,000 in today's money, in Crownsville, and gave a group of men 575 acres of land to house these mentally insane black folks in this asylum. $100,000 wasn't quite enough to complete the construction, so the heads of the hospital decided, let's put the new arrivals, people were already coming to work. And so the blacks were used as laborers, these patients, cutting down the trees, clearing the land, and helping build the buildings without pay. They were given food and lodging, not much else. There wasn't much therapy happening. The labor was said to be good therapy and the cure. If they're outside, that's really helpful. They get the fresh air. That will fix what's happening. But the working conditions were brutal. Many slept on the ground. They were crowded. Many didn't have proper clothing or shoes. And as the years passed, there was little accountability. The atrocities only increased. Experimental treatments like shock therapy utilized. And the worst part was the patient isolation. Some men and women left in solitary confinement for days at a time with little attention. Some patients left strapped in chairs when staff were overwhelmed. Some patients were murdered by staffers. And the hospital had never had enough staff over its entire history, the ratio being 200 to 1, doctor to patient. You heard it all mentioned this morning, sexual abuse for female patients prevalent. This is supposed to be a temporary place of healing and rehabilitation. It turns out to be a life sentence for many of the patients. And this doesn't really change until about the 1950s. Janice Hayes Williams, local historian who's going to be speaking to us today, says that over 1,700 people are buried in their cemetery. And worse than that, over 500 bodies, black bodies, most without patient or family consent, were given to Johns Hopkins and the University of Maryland Hospital as cadavers. It's just all sad and incomprehensible. And what are we to do? Just chalk this up to history? Because, that was the pattern of behavior in the society. That was how blacks were treated after the Civil War, up to World War II, of course, and beyond that. And that's who this country was: cruel, apathetic, prejudiced. But it's 2024. Things are better now, right? A little bit. But we have not reconciled this negative past in our own state, just up the street. So what are we supposed to do with this sordid history? Much of it guided by bad religion, bad social science like eugenics, American exceptionalism, and we can't forget patriarchy. What do we do with this early experimentation on these bodies, these black bodies at Crownsville or St. Elizabeth's or Tuskegee, just to name a few places? What do? We reconcile it. We fix it. And reconciliation comes remembering the promise from 1865 and beyond, the promise of Reconstruction, the promise that never happened, 40 acres and a mule. The check that hasn't been cashed. We remember that land is wealth and power even today. And we think about where could we have been if we were honorable people, human beings, and honored that 40 acres and a mule. Where would we be today? We'd be in a different place wholly. And so what we do when we don't want to humble ourselves, Fred talked about hubris during the middle, if we don't humble ourselves, is we start making up words like drapetomania. It's a guilt response. It's a projection of shame. When we don't accept the responsibility for our actions, we just start making stuff up. And it's so easy to see when you look around at society and just simply ask, why are things the way they are? And for me, my community, we don't have many choices. We could leave the country, no. We could completely separate ourselves. We've talked about that in the past. But as Dr. King and others say, my ancestors worked too hard, blood, sweat, and tears to build this land. I'm not going anywhere. We want the promise of liberty and freedom. We want the choices to survive and thrive wherever we choose to be. So even though we are weary, we have no choice but to keep working with our allies to change these systems that perpetuate racism. Real estate, housing, land use. That's where systemic racism has its strongest hold. And as one of your ministers, and as your black minister, it's my responsibility to call your attention to these inequities. And it is our collective responsibility to do what we can to reconcile these past sins. Indeed, they are sins. There's no better word. The question is how. Certainly, we need to keep talking about reparations, repairing the harm. And that's where I really want to get involved locally. A simple apology. I want more than that, but a simple apology. I think we can do better with that 575 acres. An apology and a financial plan that will benefit the black community first and others second. And I think we owe something to the families of those who suffered. Last week, many local people met at Rolling Nose Elementary School to discuss their hopes for Crownsville. I read about it in the paper. I was not able to go there. There are many involved in the project: county officials, project contractors, architects, civil engineers, and a historical preservation society. Everyone shared their ideas. You can join the discussion at 12:30 today, in about 20 minutes, with Janice Hayes Williams, who is quoted many times in Hilton's book. I recommend reading this book, getting involved in the process, but I want to say one more thing before I close, that the big struggle today is not really the individual prejudice. That's problematic. The bigger issue is the long-standing systemic racism in the big systems, economic, social, educational, political. And land use always brings systemic racism in the picture. Land, real estate, farming, the things that build and built wealth. These are the places we have to rectify institutional racism first in America. And that is where patriarchy has its hold. What is patriarchy? It is the white male God in human form and deified by religion. That still has a hold over us. And we have to remember that early psychiatry, like everything else, was guided by a man's opinion over what should be done to black bodies and women's bodies. And so my call to you is that we have to question everything we've ever learned. You know, when I grew up, I never went to a therapist, not until I was 36 years old and married. Now, we didn't have a lot of access in our community, but even if we did, we didn't trust therapists. We went to church. That was our therapy. The distrust of therapeutic services is real. And things have gotten a lot better. But we have to, as allies, as people of color, keep questioning everything with an anti-racist lens, psychotherapy, psychiatry, theology. It all must be questioned because it's all tainted with patriarchy and exceptionalism and racism. And until we reconcile the sins of the father, we will never create beloved community. Anne Arundel County's slogan, the best place for all, it'll just be aspirational. And I emphasize the aspirational. But we can make it real if we're willing to tell this horrible story and do something about it, this horrible story in Crownsville, and do something with those 575 acres that were turned over to our county in 2022. Do something for those families of the victims. And we might well be an example of how our great state can repair brokenness, trauma, and despair created by slavery, our original sin. We got a shot at getting this right. So let's do that. As the poet and storyteller Norma Johnson said, the journey toward liberation comes through what is buried in our ancestors' bones. Amen.